The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
A listener note: both interviews in this episode were recorded before the second assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump on Sunday, September 15th.
Breaking news: former President Donald Trump is safe, and a 20-year-old shooter is dead after a shocking assassination attempt on the former president in Pennsylvania yesterday afternoon.
For the first time in more than 40 years, a president was fired on and injured by an assassin's bullet. It was the first time since John Hinckley Jr. fired on President Ronald Reagan as he left the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C.
Coming up, we'll look at the American presidency's troubled history with political violence and what the attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania tells us about the current climate of political extremism. Next on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter.
And I'm Jamie Richardson, and welcome to this latest season of JFK 35. This season is a special one for us where we'll look at the historic nature of the 2024 election.
And we will also look back at how today's campaigns connect to those from the 1960s. We hope you'll enjoy this season as we speak with historians, journalists, and other experts to discuss presidential politics from the Kennedy era to today.
In our first episode of the series, we look at the way political violence has shaped presidential politics. Here at the JFK Library Foundation, we are all too familiar with the traumatic effect that violence can have on our country.
This bulletin: President Kennedy is dead. The President of the United States was shot down by an assassin's bullet as he rode through...
In Dallas, 1963, President John F. Kennedy would be hit twice by rifle shots from assassin Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald aimed at Kennedy from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository building and fired at the president, who was traveling in an open-air convertible.
That assassination would leave a scar on a nation that has still yet to fully heal. President Lyndon Johnson would commission a bipartisan investigation just days after the tragedy. The commission's report determined Oswald acted alone in his assassination of the president.
Despite that exhaustive report, questions about the assassination continue to persist today. Joining us to talk about the history of political violence in our nation's politics is presidential historian and award-winning author Alexis Coe. She is also a senior fellow at the bipartisan think tank New America. Alexis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Alexis, this presidential campaign has been historic in a number of ways. Unfortunately, one of those historic moments was the attempted assassination of former President Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. Now, it is not the first attempt on a candidate during the campaign trail. Robert F. Kennedy's assassin was unfortunately successful in 1968, but there have thankfully been more unsuccessful attempts during an election year. Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 and George Wallace in 1972. Can you speak about the circumstances of those two sort of lesser-known examples of assassinations on a presidential candidate?
I think Roosevelt is considered the most, if I may, fun assassination attempt. He was giving a speech. He had the speech and also, I think, an eyeglass case in his pocket, and a bullet got wedged in it. And so he did have to go to the hospital after or see a doctor, but he was not felled by it. He kept going. We do have to remember that we're talking about Teddy Roosevelt here, who is a Rough Rider and is, known as a manly man, and often like to point it out to people. That is sort of celebrated, and it's one of these kind of darkly funny anecdotes from American history that we talk about, and then when there is another attempted assassination, it reveals itself not to be that funny. There are a bunch throughout history. There was an attempt on Andrew Jackson's life, Andrew Johnson's life. The connection between all of the ones that I'm mentioning is that the person who attempted the assassination was suffering from delusions, or, what they called at that time under various names, mental health and medicine in general wasn't always standardized. But then we have, as we progress in American history, we have presidents who survived assassination attempts, but were still greatly injured. And I'm thinking about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was shot as well. And then the anecdote that everyone likes to tell, it's true, I've seen it in his archives. He complained because they cut his suit, and he was a cheap man, and he had that custom made suit, and he was mad that they cut it. And it was like, you just got shot, and they needed to operate on you. It was a real moment, though. And I think what was fascinating about that assassination attempt is how he was changed by it. After former President Trump was, we haven't actually seen the medical records, but after he was, grazed by a bullet, he said that he was changed, that he wanted unity, but of course, within the same breath, said the exact opposite and continued to do so. Reagan talked about unity. And then he also talked about gun control. And we have to remember that we're talking about Ronald Reagan here, who was a Republican, and Republicans and gun control, they don't always go together. And he didn't just talk about it in abstract forms. He wrote op-eds for the New York Times. And so he really was committed to putting country and safety over party. That was not the easiest policy to bring to the party, even as the de facto head, and a very popular one at that.
Yeah, I was going to say there was this talk of Trump being a changed man, and that being shot at would change a person, but it seems like his reaction kind of was typical of him. So we've seen how Trump kind of initially reacted, and how did the press react and the public to the attempted assassination? And how did that compare to past attempts, either failed or successful?
Well, it's so interesting. Everyone feels like they get a raw deal from the media. That is something that presidents have been complaining about since there has been a president and any sort of form of media. With Reagan, and that assassination attempt, what I've really been struck by in comparison to Trump, because it's helpful sometimes to compare leaders from the same party rather than, sometimes it feels like apples and oranges from different parties, is that his doctors gave addresses, press conferences. There was a lot of access to information and a lot of conversations that were going on. The press office was constantly answering questions from the media. With Trump, we have a letter from Ronnie Jackson, his former physician, who I believe is now a member of Congress, aspires to be, but he wasn't there. And we don't have any hospital records. We don't really know what happened. And that is strange for a historian. But what's stranger than that, in the absence of records, we look at newspaper stories as historians when we're trying to reconstruct these events. But with Trump, that would be very hard because for whatever reason, the media just kept going. They just sort of gave him a pass on that. And granted, there was a lot going on, but it felt like there should be more emphasis and there should be a greater attempt to try and understand what happened, to take control of that narrative rather than always letting him frame it and decide the boundaries of it and then sort of chasing after it. There's still time. We're still in an election. It's somehow only September. We have a couple more months to go. So I would like to see the media asking for solid answers. I just haven't.
We're living in a time now of sort of normalization and at times maybe even glorification of violence. How does this political climate we're in compare to past presidential election cycles?
Whenever there's a tremendous amount of change, we see violence. We know this. There was a spate of violence. 2 Kennedys fell prey to it, Martin Luther King, other political leaders who were visionaries. It feels like we are dealing with a lot of the same elements. There's a lot of concern over mental health that's not being addressed. And that's the cause of some of the violence, rhetoric, misinformation. And then, of course, we have an abundance of gun laws that don't really make sense. And they're usually based on pre-colonial court cases, so they really don't make sense. I think as long as there are so many elements that feel senseless, we can't really feel comfortable in this moment. I know that I am looking towards November with the understanding that the plan will be better, that violence will be anticipated simply because we have an administration that tends to learn from the past. But Trump, despite the court cases, despite everything, is still pushing the big lie. We have to be concerned not only about what's going to happen in the Capitol, but what's going to happen on Main Street.
Speaking of the former president, at a recent Trump rally in August, a person tried to storm the press section inside the venue, and Trump appeared to support those actions from the podium. Now, this is not an isolated incident for the former president, who has egged on supporters to harass people or the press at his rallies. He's referred to the press in the past as the, quote, enemy of the people. Have we had other instances, Alexis, in history where campaigns or candidates themselves are instigators or at least supporters of violence?
There have always been individuals who are heavily influenced by suggestion. No president is in love with the press. I think even John F. Kennedy, who enjoyed a pretty good relationship with them, and of course had come from a journalism background and was, as Inga Arvid said, he had the charm that made the birds sing. He felt criticized. He felt like there were stories he didn't like, and the JFK Library has such good humor about this. I think there are a couple of videos that have been uploaded to YouTube where the recordings of JFK, really upset because there were articles about a bed that had been ordered for Jackie while she was pregnant. And so you have a lot of sensitivity about topics that seem kind of silly or trivial to us now. You don't have more than criticisms of these places until you get to Donald Trump. And then you have calls for violence constantly. You have language that is hurled at the media, at anyone who disagrees with him, that is inviting violence. It is not out of the realm of what's possible to imagine that these words, the constant flow of them, and that they are never yielding to the violence that has already occurred, the disunion that people feel and talk about constantly, that he never corrects course. It's not that it goes away. People sometimes act like it has less of an impact, or we just ignore it and go on. We're all used to it. Normalizing his language doesn't make it okay, and it most certainly does not preclude further acts of violence.
As you mentioned, as we're nearing election day, there are sort of concerns about violence to not only in the Capitol, as you said, but campaign election workers, people who are counting the votes. In the past, where we've kind of seen spikes of violence in these times of change, how have people been able to kind of reject the use of violence or embrace a more balanced approach, if that has been possible, or it just takes a lot of time?
It takes a lot of time. I'm thinking about early Black voters in America and the violence that they experienced. There was also the dumping of ballots in rivers and wherever you could get rid of them. There has always been attempts to suppress the vote. We are living in an era where there is probably the least amount of voter suppression that we've experienced. Of course, the 1965 Voters Act that protected us far more, and now we don't have that. But it is an unfortunate thing. The whole entire country now, though, is aware of this, and on a local level, I know even in my little village, I live near FDR's Hyde Park. There are preparations that are already happening for the polls, which I can walk to and serve this village of 2,000. I applaud their efforts and that they want to create a safe atmosphere. I do think it is, I'm not going to say it's sad or unfortunate that it's come to this point, but that this should be a necessity we take seriously. Again, the honor system, it just doesn't work when it comes to these sorts of things.
And just for a last question, from your study of history, what do you think will it take to move America away from this violent and hyper-partisan political atmosphere we're currently in?
In order to protect the citizens of this country of every age, whether they can vote or not, we have to come together as a country, as a nation, and say that senseless violence isn't acceptable. We have to protect our children. We have to protect the most vulnerable in our society and also those who are simply going about their lives. So we need better gun control. And we also need leaders who are committed to language that helps temper violence and doesn't encourage it. And right now, we don't have that. We have Donald Trump constantly riling his followers up. And then we have a lot of poor versions of him, people who aspire to be like him. And they talk a big game. Of course, I'm thinking about Josh Hawley during the insurrection. He's, outside, he's throwing up his fist in solidarity. And then we have all these images and footage of him running through the Capitol, completely scared, panicked. Somehow that doesn't really affect anything. I mean, I hope it will. He's facing apparently like quite a challenge. But I think that's what it takes. If you have people in positions of power saying, hey, go grab the gun that's very easy for you to get and turn it on your neighbor because they don't agree with the way we want them to vote, that's a huge threat to our democracy. It's not just politics as usual.
Thank you so much, Alexis. That was wonderful. Great as always to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In this year's presidential campaign, political violence has been a strong undercurrent that has culminated with 2 different attempts on the life of former President Donald Trump. This is the first time there have been 2 attempts on a president's life in such quick succession since President Gerald Ford in 1975. Former President Trump was shot and injured earlier this summer in Butler, Pennsylvania, and just last weekend, on September 15th, the former president was targeted again at his golf course in West Palm Beach, Florida, by another assailant. The second suspect was stopped by the Secret Service and arrested by law enforcement.
Joining us to look at the cultural impact of violent rhetoric in our presidential campaigns is best-selling author Tom Nichols, who writes for The Atlantic. He is a former professor from the U.S. Naval War College and an expert to threats to democracy both at home and abroad. The interview with Tom was recorded before the most recent assassination attempt. Tom, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Tom, this episode is really to look at, the eruption of political violence over the last few years, and obviously with the attempted assassination in Butler. Starting with that, what do you think the significance was of that attack on former President Trump as far as American political history is concerned?
Well, it's interesting because I don't think it was a political act, unlike, other assassinations, right, where people have tried to kill presidents or prominent figures for political beefs. I think this was part of a long tradition going back 30, 40 years of lost young men lashing out and engaging in mass killings. And I think that's what this violence was. So I don't think it had a lot of political content to it. And I think that's probably why you're not seeing it have a real impact in this presidential race. I mean, it happened, last month, and we're barely talking about it anymore. Because I think in political terms, it doesn't, there's not a lot of content to it. Unhinged guy crawled up on a roof and shot at a presidential candidate. And I said at the time, and I turned out to be right, given what we knew about the shooter, I think if Joe Biden had been there, he would have taken a shot at him. Or anybody else that he could reach. It was just dumb luck that Donald Trump was going to that particular corner of Pennsylvania where that particular young man, was waiting to shoot someone.
Right. As you said, the shooter's motive appears to be unclear, maybe not even political. But do you believe this type of attack was bound to happen given the political polarization and rhetoric that we've kind of seen in the last 10 years in particular?
Yes, and I'm surprised that it didn't happen sooner because we have really become a society that's just out of control in the way that we talk about politics. We don't just vote for and against people. We don't just like or dislike people. We have these deeply held emotional relationships with political candidates. And I think particularly on the right, that now extends not just to presidential candidates, but to everybody. I mean, I'm surprised that there hasn't been more violence at local school committee meetings, for that matter, given the way people talk about the kind of existential threats that they think are lurking, in their local city halls and town councils. It's really unhealthy and it's really, really dangerous.
And jumping back a bit to the last century, there's been a lot of political violence has been used as a tool or opportunity for authoritarians to impose their will. What do you think are some historical examples of political violence that you have that Americans could pay attention to?
Well, we've been fortunate, although I have to tell you, I feel really old when you said last century, and I realized the one I was born in.
Oh, same here. Same
here.
But I think Americans have been fortunate that there aren't that many good analogies. If you think about political violence that has kicked off horrendous consequences, you think about something like the assassination of Sergei Kirov in the Soviet Union in 1934. That is marks the beginning of the Great Purges, where millions of people are killed and imprisoned, or the Night of the Long Knives in Germany, or other places where political violence. Rwanda is another example where two presidents are killed when their airplane is shot down, and that triggers the beginning of the Rwandan genocide. We've been fortunate that way, that there aren't a lot of good analogies to that in the United States. So I think in terms of historical political violence in democracies, we don't have a lot of good analogies, but unfortunately, we've become the model for that kind of violence, I think, in other places where, we think about assassinations, and, the United States has some of the most dramatic such incidents. And I think that's in part because we are a big country with a single leader in the president, and that naturally attracts, people who are going to take pot shots. Remember, we've had more assassination attempts than we've had assassinations. Poor Gerald Ford, who, I think never gets quite his due as a great president. Gerald Ford had to endure 2 assassination attempts within months of each other. But again, in the same way that I think Donald Trump just went through, neither of Ford's would-be assassins, one of them was a former, Manson family member, and the other was a middle-aged woman who was depressed. So, not a lot of political content there. So I don't think there are a lot of great historical analogies, and I think we should be grateful for that, but I think we should also be concerned that we here in the United States seem to be creating them for other people, as an example.
And one example that we obviously think about a lot is the 1963, the act of political violence that ended President Kennedy's life. At that time, how did America respond to that action? And did it fuel other acts of violence in the decade?
The assassination of President Kennedy was such a shock to our system. We hadn't lost a president since the 19th century. There had been attempts, right? Someone tried to take out Franklin Roosevelt, but this was something televised, happens live. The actual shooting wasn't televised, but the reporting starts to happen in real time. And I think the effect was a kind of loss. This is going to sound almost like a cliche, but it was a loss of innocence. This can happen here. That, a popular, young, handsome, president in an open car visiting the American people gets killed in front of thousands and thousands of American citizens. I think I'll say this as a personal note. Every time I see a president in front of a large crowd, even at an inauguration, I sort of have that moment of saying, boy, that feels like, Kennedy in the middle of Dallas, that I'm always worried about seeing a president. And that's a terrible thing. I mean, in a democracy, the president should be able to walk the streets, as safely as anybody else. Whether it triggered more violence later, I think we were just entering a violent decade because of the amount of change that was going to happen in the 1960s. And there's not a lot to link. If you think about the 3 great assassinations of that period, John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, there's not a lot to bind the assassins there. There's not a lot of similarity between Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray, and Sirhan Sirhan. This is just the kind of chaos of political change that I think motivates unhinged people to do terrible things. If there's one of those that is more political than the other, it's King being assassinated by Ray. But I think that once again, like the 60s, we're living in a time where the political temperature is so high that it encourages unhinged people, with marginal control or marginally tethered to reality, to emulate those examples and to think about finding their own moment of fame. But I think that's something that's really important about this period in history, is that these mass shooters, whether they're political or otherwise, they're looking for their moment in the light, that this is the product of a very narcissistic age. And I think political figures just happen to be in the crosshairs just like everyone else.
As you're mentioning that there's sort of echoes between what we're seeing today and 1960, I wanted to know maybe if you wanted to dig deeper into the two situations, the chaos of the 1960s and what we're seeing sort of in this era that may be similar.
The tragedy of the comparison between the 1960s and the 2020s is that in the 1960s, particularly in the mid-1960s, once the Vietnam War was underway, there was a lot of anger and chaos in America that was justifiably intense and understandable, whether it was civil rights or people being drafted and being sent off, in the tens of thousands to Vietnam, where I think it's good to remind people listening to this that we were taking casualties every week in Vietnam that were, approaching levels that we would see every year in a place like Afghanistan or Iraq. People forget just how high, I think, certainly people that are not old enough or didn't have relatives there, how high that body count was. And that, when you're losing thousands and thousands of young men, that really does raise the social temperature, and understandably so. What's shocking to me about comparing that to the 1960s, where women were fighting for their rights, minorities were fighting for their rights, kids were worried about being sent into a war. The 2020s are a period of relative peace and affluence. No one's being drafted. Poverty is not rampant throughout the United States. We still have a long way to go on civil rights and women's rights, and there are a lot of hot button issues there, but nothing compared to, the 1960s, where minorities were basically non-people when it came to things like voting. And yet we have, because of social media, because of television, because of cable, because of our boredom, frankly, and the ability to amuse ourselves by becoming tribal and partisan, we actually have this intense rage spreading through the country that is going to get people killed. And I always find myself sitting back and saying, and for what? It's not for civil rights. It's not because of the draft. It's not cities burning because of people being oppressed en masse. It's people threatening each other in, grocery stores over masks. And it's kind of a national insanity. I wrote about this a few years ago, and I said that America was descending into a mass psychosis. And I think that the two periods are similar in the intensity of the emotion and the danger that we're starting to present to each other, but not even close in terms of the actual change and ferment that would drive that kind of social movement or that kind of social pathology. And I think that's really astonishing and kind of terrifying.
It really makes you wonder what that period would have been like had they had the same level of television and cable that this era does.
And a loosening of all the social restrictions on just generally antisocial behavior. Where people in the 21st century feel free to just put pictures of the president of the United States tied up and gagged on the back of their trucks. I mean, even in a really partisan and angry age like the 1960s, I mean, you just didn't see stuff like that. No matter how much you hated, I mean, yes, you'd have rallies and people would get hung in effigy, but you didn't have the daily experience of going to the supermarket and seeing somebody, with a flag that says F the president. It just we were just a different country. And again, the irony being that in the 1960s, I think certainly people had much more justifiable cause for being afraid and angry across the political spectrum. Whereas today, this is almost entirely an expression of boredom and affluence and, sort of just unfocused rage that really in makes no sense in almost any political context.
Yeah, and you think about you talk about this social behavior and you wonder where's the responsibility for that? Republicans are saying Democrats are responsible for enabling things like the Black Lives Matter protests or campus protests over Gaza. Democrats will look at the Republicans and point to January 6th and that behavior. Where do you look at the responsibility for how this, like, as you say, the social norms sort of being broken down? Like, how do you see how that happened, and who's sort of to blame if there's one particular or multiple people to blame for this?
Well, one thing that I think is at the root of all of this, and I'll talk about in a second, I think we need to talk about the difference between campus protests, which I've written about and I deplored, and trying to overthrow the government, which is, in a whole other ballpark. But nonetheless, I think part of it at the root of all this is that we are a much more cruder society than we used to be. We are much more tolerant of, sort of public displays of jerkitude in general, of just, being rotten to each other in public. But there's also this problem where I think people crave a sense of authenticity and importance and involvement. And I think you see that across the political spectrum, so that the people that are running around with, conspiracy theory flags, it's another way of saying, look, my life isn't really boring. I'm not just a guy who works, at a department store. I'm hunting pedophiles. I'm saving the world. I'm Tony Stark. The same with these campus protests, which have become just vicious and really kind of, I mean, in that case, I think the universities bear a lot of blame for putting up with this kind of behavior rather than educating students out of it. But you see the same thing of students saying, well, I'm not being drafted. I'm not, protesting for civil rights in the middle of Detroit against the National Guard. So I'm going to adopt this other cause and become very virtuous and occupy the school building on behalf of people, far away, because this makes me feel involved and authentic and heroic. And I think that overblown sense of narcissism and heroism drives people to do things that eventually lead to violence. Because once your cause is that big, why wouldn't you engage in violence? If you're stopping genocide, if you're saving children, if you're trying to save the government. I think the one difference here is that in an earlier age, when we've been talking about the 1960s, the idea that, college kids talked about overthrowing the government, but they weren't going to do that. What they were really saying is they wanted to not be drafted. You didn't have a mass of middle Americans who basically said, if I don't get the things I want from elections or political leaders, then the entire Constitution is a sham and the entire American government doesn't work. And that kind of nihilism, that kind of reckless inflation, where everything becomes a cosmic reason for overthrowing the government, I think is something that I think is new. And again, there were certainly more reasons to do that in the 1960s. There was more injustice, more poverty. It's amazing to me that people today who talk about the deep state and think the government is too powerful seem to have never heard of, J. Edgar Hoover, and the completely unaccountable law enforcement and national security apparatus that existed in the 1960s and the 1950s. But here we are. And I think, again, that's people saying, I have to be important. I have to be part of a big cause that makes me feel somehow that I'm part of the great flow of events in human history. And that's how people end up getting killed, I think.
And I think in the coverage of Butler, there was an interesting thing where a lot of people talking about being shocked, surprised that this just came out of nowhere, despite the fact that, in the last 10 years or more, we've seen people beaten at political rallies, election workers threatened with death. Do you think there's sort of a myth from a lot of people that sort of America's immune to that kind of political violence? And how do these acts, when they occur, erode our democracy's health?
Well, I think the threats of violence, and again, I don't mean to keep kind of pushing Butler to the side as a political act, but every time I see a large crowd of people, I don't think about political violence. I think about school shooters. And I think what happened in Butler was basically a kid who a few years ago would have been a school shooter and instead became a mass shooter at a political event. But I think the threats of violence and the constant rhetoric of violence, where people are told, we've seen incidents where, election officials and journalists and, local in places that you wouldn't expect have literally had to leave their homes because of threats of violence. And I think that is deeply corrosive to democracy, because that tells people that the safest thing to do is not get involved. And once people decide that their safety lies in not getting involved in any way in politics or political discourse, then you're on the road to dictatorship. Then you're on the road to the Soviet Union, not just Nazism or Stalinism, but you're on the road to that kind of boring drudgery of daily authoritarianism, where people simply say, look, I don't get involved. The government does things, and yes, my neighbor disappeared, but I just don't get involved. It's just safer for me. I have my family to think about. And Americans were not that people. We've never been that kind of people. We're the kind of people that shoot our mouths off. We're the kind of people that do get involved. We're the kind of people that do raise hell about things. But I think when people start thinking, if I go and volunteer at my local polling station as an election official, somebody's going to kill me. If I serve on my school board, I'm going to need police to get me home from meetings. Then I think that's even more destructive to democracy than the kind of the big show-stopping event, like Butler. I hate to say this, people expect nationally prominent politicians to have death threats, because that's always been the case, right? Presidents, there's a reason the Secret Service protects presidents, because presidents attract kooks and political extremists and death threats. What we're not used to in this country is turning to our neighbors, in a small town in Wisconsin or Georgia or Pennsylvania and saying, hearing them say, I'm not going to serve on the election board because I don't want to get killed. That's how democracy ends.
And do you think something that could be contributing to this violence is a result of the personalities in our political leadership, or are there other factors at play, like prolonged economic crisis, racism, xenophobia, other changes that are fueling violence?
This violent rhetoric is being fueled by political opportunists, and particularly I would argue, particularly by the right-wing media ecosystem that just delivers these huge jolts of fear to people every day. If you, as I have, when I was, a scholar of politics and working on books about democracy, I would watch this stuff all day. I would spend an evening watching these programs and right-wing channels and talk radio. And, it really is just this massive injection of cortisol into your bloodstream for 3-4 hours at a time. The immigrants are coming to kill you. Your daughters are going to be raped. Deep state is listening to this phone call. By 11 o'clock every night, you're a shaking wreck. And that, I think, has really changed the political landscape. I think that has created a group of people that are neither of the far, I think it's fair to say, neither of the right nor the left, but rather this mass of people who may have identified politically in different ways until maybe 10 or 15 years ago, who now identify with this kind of gigantic paranoid streak in American politics. And that's where you get the people that are willing to do violence. You're not going to find a whole lot of people, certainly not since the 1970s, right? When the people that were doing political violence were committed leftists, the Weathermen, the Panthers, the people that said, we're doing this for revolution and liberation. I think what you have to worry about now are people who are going to walk into pizza places and shoot the joint up because they've just been watching too much TV or spending too much time on the internet. And that fusion between the immense amount of political coverage that people take in every day, which I don't think the human brain is capable of doing, and this kind of boredom and paranoia that leads people to just sit for hours on the internet, that to me is the real danger. I do think we have to say something about just the general volume of news and information and kind of infotainment that people take in all day. That's really unhealthy. I always tell people, every time I give a talk about stuff like this, people say, well, what do you read? What do you watch? And I say, look, I'm paid to have political opinions, and I probably don't watch as much TV as you do. I just don't. I mean, I read a couple of newspapers a day. I kind of cruise social media for stories that I've missed somewhere. I spend a lot of time on social media, but as people who know me realize, half of that time is spent talking about cats and Star Trek. But people really do spend an inordinate amount of time taking in, like, gigabytes and terabytes of political information all day. And eventually that warps your brain. It makes you unable to see the world in anything but the tribal terms of whatever channel you're watching. It's just unhealthy.
And whoever wins in November, what do you think they'll need to do in their administration to bring America back from this kind of hysteria and cliff of political violence that we're sitting on? And how can we take the temperature down?
Well, I'm going to take issue with the way you phrased whoever wins. If Donald Trump wins, he fully intends to crank the temperature to the surface of the sun. I mean, he has said so, and we are going to be in for a very, very dark time. I mean, Trump has said he's going to get even with his enemies, and he's going to, every time he talks about weaponizing the state, he's really projecting. I mean, he's talked about how he plans to do that and to act against his political opponents, against journalists, against people in the other party that he doesn't like. If the Democrats win the White House, I think the thing that takes the temperature down is what happened in 2020 when Biden took over. You just govern. You withdraw from the political combat and you say, we're going to pass bills and we're going to build roads and we're going to do all those things that are not sexy and not glamorous and, don't really contribute to having a big political argument. I think that actually worked. And I think that did take the temperature in America down. I think for the rest of us, it's, at some point, and again, I think this is something I would apply to. I don't like to both sides things, but I would apply to both sides of the political equation in some sense, that we have to get over this political hypochondria that the minute something happens that we don't like, an election happens we don't like, it's all over and we're all going to die. If Donald Trump wins, I think we do face an existential threat to democracy, but people can still do things to fight that. They can go to court. There's still laws. There are still lawyers. There are still public associations and other things that they can do that aren't just screaming at other people. There are things that you can do quietly and with discipline and dedication to do that. And I think people on the right, at some point, I'm a former Republican. I remember these discussions. If Barack Obama's elected, it's socialism and the end of America. Well, if he's reelected, it's socialism and the end of America. And if, Biden's elected, it's communism and on and on and on. And at some point, you have to say, maybe that's not true. Maybe you don't have to think that way every day. But I don't know how to get people to that point because, again, they'll be told every night, you are living in a failing communist society, which is nuts, but it's a hard message to overcome.
And I guess ending this conversation, which has, depending on how you look at this, very dark, or maybe there's some hope. What about you? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the country's chances to survive the current moment?
I am somewhat pessimistic about this current moment, no matter who wins. Because no matter what happens in November, tens of millions of people are going to vote for an authoritarian. And I think it would be an amazing step forward if the United States has its first woman president. That would be quite something. But I think that is going to make the people who oppose such things even more dangerous and even more angry, at least for a while. And so I think we're faced with an outcome over the next few years where either we are going to have an authoritarian, a would-be autocrat walk into the presidency, or we are going to have movements in various places across the United States that are going to be dedicated to violence against the government. Because we are no longer a country that understands civic virtue. We are no longer, millions of us are no longer people who can accept losing an election. And even millions more of us are simply not connected to reality anymore and living in a, complete paranoid fantasy. And I don't think that's going to change, even if Donald Trump is finally defeated once and for all in 2024. I think that's going to go on.
As someone who was, a Republican, do you think that if, say, Donald Trump does lose, that the party can turn itself around from sort of the state that it's currently in?
That's such an interesting question, because the Republican Party is no longer a party. It doesn't function like a normal political party. It's a movement. And if Trump is defeated, I assume that at some point that movement, has to lose steam, because, Donald Trump's 78 years old. He's not going to run for president again. And so I'm kind of curious to see if the remnants of some sensible Republican Party kind of come out of their bunkers or hiding places. But I'm really pessimistic about that, because, the people that were supposed to do that were supposed to be people like Larry Hogan and Nikki Haley and, even Richard Burr, this really struck me the other day. Richard Burr, a North Carolina Republican senator who has retired and was part of the whole impeachment drama and, clearly not a fan of Donald Trump, said, well, yes, I'm going to have to vote for him. Because again, they are trapped in this very rigid paradigm that says, my partisan identification is so strong that I simply can never choose the good of the public, the good of the country over my partisan affiliations. And so I'm not optimistic that the Republicans can overcome that. When you have retired Republicans who have nothing to lose by saying no one should vote for Donald Trump and doing it anyway, when you have Nikki Haley and J.D. Vance and Elise Stefanik and all these other Republicans betraying everything they ever said about Donald Trump in order to be close to power, then I'm just not sure that gets better. But I do think that the Republican Party will get a chance to breathe. Again, what's left of the Republican Party will get a chance to breathe and have a discussion without Donald Trump's kind of smothering influence over the party. But that'll have to start at the top. And I'll just add one more thing, which is, Trump probably understood this, which is why he decided to basically make the Republican National Committee an extension of his family. And so if you're a Republican and you're thinking about reform, where do you go when, the RNC is being run by, like a mafia? And I'm not sure that they're, even if Trump's defeated, that they're going to be able to get out from under that, because Trump will want to suck every last dollar out of all of that before he lets go of it.
Well, a turbulent time in American politics. I appreciate you giving us some of your time to talk about sort of what's been going on and what might be ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our first episode in our special season looking at the historic nature of the 2024 election. We will have a new episode each Thursday until Election Day. If you're interested in learning more about some of the topics we discussed today, you can visit our podcast page for this episode.
If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tweet at us at JFK Library using the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening and have a great week.